Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Market Access Africa. So I'll pick it up from where my previous two speakers led off. And since my time has been curtailed, I'll have to jump into some numbers quickly, right? So today's theme is pivoting Africa as a net food exporter. So let's look at some numbers quickly. Africa has 18% of the world's arable lands. That means Africa has 253 million hectares of land. Out of this 253 million hectares of land, 203 million hectares are used for production of crops. The balance 50 million hectares of land is still available that can be converted at low cost, relatively low cost, into agricultural lands. And these are temporary fallow lands, temporary meadows and pastures. On this 203 million hectares of land that is available, that is cropped, Africa produces a variety of food, a variety of crops, millions and millions of tons of crops, right? The biggest out of them, 235 million plus tons of cereals and grains. Maize, almost 92 million tons. Rice, which is paddy, 39 million tons. Sorghum, 29 million tons. Wheat, 27 million tons, and so on and so forth. Along with such large quantities of cereals, Africa also produces over 350 million tons of tubers. Cassava being the largest, 208 million tons of cassava. Yam, 86 million tons, sweet potatoes and potatoes. Africa also produces a lot of other fruits, vegetables, and other horticultural products. With all this, the question is, why is Africa a net food importer? To answer that question, we need to look into our crop yields. So I believe a lot of farmers are in this group and they would understand that Africa's crop yields are far below the world averages. Cereals production in Africa, the cereal average yield is just 1.6 tons per hectare compared to the world average of 4 tons per hectare. Let me take an example of rice, which Mr. Edwin also gave here. The rice yields in Africa are 50% lower than the world average. That is, the world produces rice, the world's average is 4.6 tons to a hectare, whereas the yields across Africa is just 2.3 tons per hectare. Now, Africa cultivates 16.5 million hectares of land for producing rice. And that 16.5 million hectares of land at 2.34 tons per hectare gives us 39 million tons of paddy, which converts to 23 million tons of rice. On top of this 23 million tons of rice, Africa imports 15 million tons of rice every year. So how do we now cover up that gap between imports and production? By getting into new lands perhaps, but not required. Because if we increase our yields by just 1.5 tons to a hectare in these 16.5 million hectares that we already cultivate, we can get 25 million tons of paddy, which converts to 15 million tons of rice. And yet, we'll still be at 3.8 tons of yield, which is still 0.8 tons lower than the world average. If we can take up these yields to the world averages of 4.6 tons per hectare, we can have an additional 8 million tons of rice that can be exported out of Africa. And this is exactly the amount of rice. This 8 million is exactly the amount of rice that Nigeria consumes in a year. 7.5 to 8 million tons of rice. So yield improvement is the key focus area. Look at maize, for example. How much maize does Africa produce? 92 million tons of maize. And the average yields are just 2.2 tons versus world average of 6.1. Africa imports 9 to 10 million tons of maize every year, even after producing 92 million tons of maize. If we can improve that yield by just 10%, from taking it from 2.2 to 2.4, we can get 9 million tons of maize additional. So no need to import, right? Mind you, the varieties that are being cultivated in Africa has very high yield potential. Just to give you an example, before I took over as the MD of Olam Agri, I was producing rice in Nasarawa state. Olam has a large rice farm, 4,500 hectares, which we cultivate, where we get 4.7 to 5 tons of yields using the same varieties, Faro 44, L31, right? So it's the yield and the potential is much higher. The Faro 44s have much higher yield potentials. Let's look at one more example, cassava. The 208 million tons of cassava that we produce, what is the average yield? Just 8.2 tons per hectare in Africa. While there are countries in Africa, in Asia that produces 36 tons per hectare. In Zambia, some parts, we get 28 tons per hectare. Imagine if you can just double it. Don't go to 28, 30 tons. Just double it from 8 to 16 tons. You have another 200 million tons of cassava. A lot of problems would be solved because of that. Now, what is the issue here? So since I don't have much time to speak on this, what are the issues causing? The single largest issue that needs to be addressed, and the single largest problem in this, is the low fertilizer usage in Africa. Look at the nitrogen usage in Africa versus world average. The average world, in an average, nitrogen usage is 65 kgs per hectare, whereas in Africa we use only 16 kgs per hectare at an average. That is just 24% of the world averages, right? Similarly, phosphorus. We use 29 kgs of, we use 6 kgs of phosphorus versus 29 kgs of phosphorus which is used worldwide. Overall NPK consumption in the world is 120 kgs to a hectare, whereas in Africa, we use only 26 kgs to a hectare. If this one single point can be addressed, and also the quality of the fertilizer. We being a commercial rice farm in Nasirabad state, we test our fertilizers before we buy, and we have found out in so many places that the fertilizer quality is not up to the mark. That needs to be regulated for sure. But if the fertilizer usage can be increased to the world averages, 50-60% of the problem is gone. You don't need to get into additional lands. We can use with the same water resources, with the same lands, we can increase our yields and hence crop production. The second important part which needs to be looked at on the big ticket item is mechanization rates. Africa's usage of machinery is extremely low. Africa uses only 0.01 HP horsepower per hectare of agric land. And because of which we have a lot of harvest losses, lots of harvest losses. The world average is 0.67, and mind you, Asia's average is 1.4 HP per hectare. So we need to implement machinery and technology in our farmlands. And then the third thing is the storage solutions, the drying and storage. We lose a lot of crop even after harvesting because we don't have storage solutions in Africa and drying storage solutions in Africa. If these three things are looked after, which can be done and done very easily, along with the rural road infrastructures, we don't need any other thing but these three things, especially the first point with the fertilizer. We can become a net food exporter in the next 2 to 3 years. It's not a big thing, provided we do these things on ground. Another important factor, which is where a lot of investment needs to come in, is irrigation. We cultivate in Africa 203 million hectares of land, right? But only 10 to 15% of the food production happens in the dry season. If we can improve that, if we can have irrigation infrastructure, even if we can get additional 100 million hectares of land into cultivation, the same lands, right? It's a game changer. That's all where the focus should be. There are so many other things, yes, varieties, integrated pest management, and other solutions, technology, access to capital. But these will solve 70-80% of the problems. So thank you so much. I'll rest my case there in case if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. Please, do we have any question? I'll take just one question. Okay, so I'm only allowed to take one question. So if we have more questions, we can meet him during the tea break and ask him, or you can write them down and I'll take them to him so that we just don't spend too much time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was very insightful. I'm Bumi Maisela from SE Holdings in South Africa. I have a question with regards to the fertilizer trends that you were showing in terms of the usage in Africa versus the other, the other countries. The biggest challenge smallholder farmer face is production costs. What are the solutions around, whilst we are solving for increased fertilizers, to ensure that the farmers still are profitable in their business? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a good question. So see, if your yields go up times 2, your production costs are taken care of. I mean, your average costs are taken care of, right? But the governments there has to be a lot of interventions from governments, from private sector, as well as from NGOs to ensure that adequate fertilizer, the right kind of fertilizers are provided to the farmers, along with other inputs. The cost of those needs to be, for example, Nigeria, we used to have a GESS scheme wherein fertilizer and seeds and other things used to be subsidized by the government. That has gone off for the last 7-8 years. So those things, if implemented properly, these things can be done. And that's why I'm saying, like, it's not that the governments have not done it before. It's not that the private sector have not done it before. The focus has to be there. The focus has to be on the production part, and it can be achieved. It's not something that you have to create. There's already a channel that exists to supply all these inputs to various farmers, and their cost can be reduced on that front. Just double their yields, like as Mr. Edwin was also mentioning, the farmers they were not going to farms because of no money. I mean, they were not making enough money. But improve the yields and you will see the money coming in. Thank you so much.